You will not believe the Thanksgiving I had last year. Seriously, my aunt threw a wine glass and had a screaming meltdown because I didn't tell her about my pregnancy before anyone else. And then, then I dropped a bomb that exposed her darkest secret to the entire family. What the hell happened next? My husband Wesley and I had been trying for almost 3 years. So, when we found out I was pregnant in early October, we were beyond overjoyed, but also completely terrified. The winter before, I'd had a miscarriage that just gutted us both. My doctor said everything looked healthy this time, but still recommended waiting until after 12 weeks to tell people, just to be safe. We decided Thanksgiving would be perfect. The whole family gathers every year, and I'd be exactly 14 weeks by then. I only told my sister Claire and my cousin Jason because they both knew about the miscarriage. They'd checked on me every single week since, and they promised not to breathe a word. They actually kept it. Now, about my Aunt Marlene. She's my mom's older sister, 58 years old, and she's appointed herself the boss of this entire family. She genuinely believes she's the person everyone is supposed to tell things to first. The week before Thanksgiving, she called me, fishing for news. "Do you have anything you want to share?" she asked, her voice dripping with expectation. I played it cool. "No, just excited to see everyone." She said I seemed different and pressed if something was going on. I quickly changed the subject to her garden, and she dropped it, but I could hear the suspicion in her voice. Here's the thing about Marlene, she physically cannot let anyone else be the one to share news. When I got engaged, I called her because I was so happy, thinking I was doing the right thing. An hour later, she posted it on Facebook, using a photo she'd swiped off my private page, tagging the entire family before I could even tell my own grandmother. My promotion? Announced at Sunday dinner before I walked in the door. When Wesley and I bought our house, she put it in the family group chat with a picture and a gushing paragraph, again, before I could say a single word myself. She always claimed she was just so excited she couldn't help herself. But it was never about excitement. It was about control, about being the one holding the information. So, this time, Wesley and I agreed we would not tell her a thing until we told everyone at once. There's one more crucial piece you need to understand about Marlene. For several years, she'd been my Grandma Ruth's caretaker. Grandma Ruth is 83 and still lives in her own house, but Marlene handled everything for her. Doctor appointments, groceries, and especially the money. She set up bill payments, managed accounts. She took over all of it after Grandpa died. The whole family was grateful. My mom used to say she didn't know what we'd do without Marlene, that she was a saint. Marlene loved being told that. She'd wave it off. Family takes care of family. But you could tell she lived for the credit. Everyone treated her like the glue that held us together. That was the version of Marlene everyone believed in. Keep that in mind, because it matters. Thanksgiving came, and it was at my parents' house that year instead of Marlene's, which I think already had her in a mood. After dinner, I stood up and said Wesley and I had an announcement. I told everyone we were expecting due in May. The room erupted. Claire was crying happy tears. My mom had her hands over her mouth. Grandma Ruth started clapping. Everyone was hugging us. Everyone except Marlene. She just sat there staring at me, her jaw tight. Then she started crying, but not the happy kind. These were angry tears. She asked how long I'd known, and I said about 6 weeks. That's when she lost it. She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor and yelled that I was supposed to tell her first. She said she's the one who holds this family together, the one everyone comes to, and I had gone behind her back like she was nobody. She demanded to know who else knew before her. Claire and Jason went quiet, but Marlene read it on their faces instantly and started screaming at them too for keeping secrets. She said the whole family had decided to freeze her out, treat her like she couldn't be trusted. My mom tried to calm her down, but Marlene turned on her, asking if she'd known. My mom said no, and Marlene didn't even believe her. My dad finally told her to sit down and be happy for me, but she said, how could she be happy when I had deliberately humiliated her in front of everyone by making her the last to know? She said, after everything she does for this family, after everything she sacrifices, this is how I repay her? Then she went after Wesley, saying he turned me against my own family and taught me to shut people out. Wesley, bless his heart, calmly said, we just wanted to wait until we were past the danger zone because of what happened last time. Marlene scoffed. That's a ridiculous excuse. You clearly just wanted to make me feel small. And then she said the words that would seal her fate. She said, real family tells each other everything immediately. That's what loyalty is. The irony of that sentence coming out of her mouth was almost too much, but nobody in the room knew yet why. My sister Claire finally snapped. Maybe if you could keep a single thing to yourself for once in your life, people would actually tell you things. And that was it. Marlene grabbed her wine glass and threw it at the wall. It shattered everywhere. Claire's little boy, who was 4, burst into tears. Grandma Ruth flinched so hard she dropped her fork. Marlene's husband, my Uncle Keith, jumped up and tried to get her to leave, but she refused. She said she wasn't going anywhere until I apologized for disrespecting her. I stood my ground. I'm not apologizing for protecting my own announcement after what I'd been through. She screamed that I was an ungrateful, selfish person, and she was done with me. She told her kids to get their coats and started grabbing the serving dishes she brought, shoving them into her bags like she was making a dramatic point. And while she was standing there, dramatically packing up her Tupperware and lecturing the whole room about loyalty, something in me just went cold and steady. I stood up. I looked her right in the eye and I said, if we're all sharing everything now like real family, then everyone in this room should know that Aunt Marlene has been taking money out of Grandma's accounts for the last 2 years. Keith rose, his coat half on. Marlene went the color of the tablecloth. The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Keith's face changed from confused to sick in about 2 seconds flat. Because Keith didn't know, he'd been trusting that their finances were fine, that his wife had everything handled, and I watched the floor drop out from under him in real time. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Marlene's hands started shaking around the bag she was holding. She tried to speak, and only made this strange, choked sound. Grandma Ruth looked around at all of us and asked in this small, confused voice, "What did I mean? Was her money gone?" My mom rushed over to her. Keith sat down the dish he was holding very slowly, grabbed his keys off the counter, and headed straight for the door. Marlene finally found her voice and started saying, it wasn't what everyone thought, that I didn't understand, that she could explain. But Keith was already out the door. She ran after him, and we all heard her screaming his name in the driveway. Her 2 teenage kids sat frozen at the table, looking like they wanted to disappear. Claire's little boy was still wailing. My mom had one arm around Grandma and was making those soft shushing sounds. My dad sat there with a look on his face like someone had hit him with a shovel. Jason got up and started picking the big pieces of broken glass off the floor because nobody else was moving. Claire stared at me with huge eyes but didn't say a word. Wesley reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Outside, we could hear Marlene still yelling, begging Keith to wait, to let her explain. Then a car door slammed and an engine turned over. Her voice got louder and more desperate, but the car pulled out of the driveway anyway. We listened to it fade down the street, and then it was quiet, except for the little boy crying and Grandma asking over and over what was happening. Marlene came back inside about 20 minutes later. Her makeup was running down her face in black lines and her eyes were swollen and red. She stood in the doorway, breathing hard like she'd been running down the street after the car. She looked around at all of us and said Keith had driven off and wasn't answering her calls. She pulled out her phone and tried calling him again right there in front of everyone, and we could all hear it go straight to voicemail. She tried texting, and her hands were shaking so badly she kept dropping the phone. Then she turned and looked at me with an expression of pure hatred. She screamed that I had destroyed her marriage and her whole life just to get back at her over a stupid pregnancy announcement. She said I was evil and calculated, and she would never forgive me. My mom tried to calm her, but Marlene just kept screaming that I'd planned this, that I'd been sitting on it, waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate her in front of the entire family. Wesley stood up and told her that wasn't true, that she was the one who started all of this by throwing a fit in a wine glass. Marlene told him to shut his mouth and said he poisoned me against my own blood. My dad finally spoke up, and his voice was quiet but hard. He said Marlene needed to take responsibility for her own choices instead of blaming me for exposing them. He said she made the decision to take Grandma's money, and she made the decision to lie to every single one of us about it, including her own husband. Marlene turned on him and said he didn't understand. Nobody understood the pressure she'd been under, how hard her life really was behind the scenes. Then she just collapsed into one of the dining room chairs and put her face in her hands, and her whole body shook. My mom, who I honestly don't know how she did it, went over and put a hand on her shoulder. Marlene looked up and said she'd been drowning for years and she didn't know how to fix it, and she never meant for any of it to happen. She said she was going to pay every cent back. She just needed time. She'd always meant to pay it back. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, but the whole time she was looking at Grandma and my mom, not at me. My mom quietly suggested Marlene take her kids home, that everyone needed space to process. Marlene nodded and gathered up her teenagers who wouldn't look at her, and she packed up her dishes with shaking hands. She didn't look at me once on her way out. She just herded her kids into the car and drove away. The rest of us stood in the wreckage of what was supposed to be Thanksgiving. After they left, Jason found the broom and swept up the glass. Claire and I cleared the table without talking. My mom sat with Grandma at the kitchen table holding her hand, because Grandma kept asking if she was going to lose her house. My dad just stood at the window, staring out at the driveway. Wesley helped me carry dishes into the kitchen. The whole house felt heavy and wrong. Nothing like a holiday. Wesley and I left about an hour later after helping clean up. The drive home was silent at first, then about halfway back, I just started crying and couldn't stop. All I could think about was that I'd wanted this to be the happy memory of announcing our baby, the one we'd earned after everything, and instead, it had turned into a disaster. Wesley reached over and held my hand while he drove. He said, "Marlene's choices were not your fault." He reminded me that she came at me first, that she threw a glass and had a full meltdown over me, not telling her about my pregnancy early. He said I had every right to defend myself after she came at me that hard. I knew he was right, but I still felt sick. I kept seeing Keith's face when I said it, the way it went from confused to broken. I kept seeing Grandma's small, scared face, asking if her money was gone. Wesley pulled into our driveway and turned the car off and just held me while I cried on his shoulder. He said we were going to be okay and the baby was going to be okay, and that was what mattered. We went inside and I took a long shower and cried some more. Wesley made tea, and we sat on the couch and he put on a movie neither of us watched. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from different family members. There were texts from my mom, my dad, Claire, Jason, and even relatives I barely spoke to. The longest one was from my mom, asking me to please explain how I knew about the money. I called her back and she picked up on the first ring. I told her the whole thing. About a month earlier, I'd gone over to help Grandma set up her new tablet and pay a couple of bills online because Marlene had been too busy that week. When I logged into Grandma's banking, the checking account had almost nothing in it, which made no sense because Grandma has a good pension and her house is paid off. I scrolled up, and there was a long list of transfers going out to Marlene. Some of them for a few hundred, some for thousands, going back months and months. And there was a notification about a home equity line of credit that had been opened against Grandma's house, which Grandma didn't even understand when I asked her about it. She said Marlene had her sign some papers, but she didn't know what they were. I told Mom I'd been carrying all of that around for a month, not knowing what to do with it, terrified of blowing up the family, hoping I was somehow wrong. My mom went silent for a long time. Then she said she wished I'd come to her privately instead of announcing it in front of everyone like that. I said I wished Marlene hadn't thrown a wine glass and screamed at me for protecting my own pregnancy. My mom was quiet again. Then she said she understood I'd been defending myself, but that the way it came out had done a lot of damage. She said Marlene had called her at 3 in the morning, completely hysterical, that Keith still wasn't answering, and that Grandma had barely slept. My dad called me separately about an hour later. He said he fully supported me and that Marlene had needed a wake-up call for years. That she'd been acting like she ran everyone's lives without a single consequence, but he said he was worried about Grandma and about Keith and the kids. He asked if I knew how much money we were talking about. I told him I only saw the statements. I didn't know the full number, but it looked like a lot. He said Keith was probably finding out the exact number right now, and that it was going to be worse than any of us wanted it to be. 3 days went by with no word from Marlene. I texted her once to ask if she was okay, and she didn't respond. Claire drove past her house and said both cars were in the driveway, but nobody answered the door. My mom was worried sick and kept calling, but Marlene only picked up once to say she was fine and needed space. Keith finally answered my dad on the 3rd day. He said he was staying at his brother Corbin's place and needed time to think. My dad asked if he wanted to talk, and Keith said not yet. That same afternoon, Corbin called my dad himself. He wanted to know exactly what had happened at Thanksgiving because Keith wouldn't give him any details. My dad walked him through the whole thing. The announcement, Marlene's meltdown, the wine glass, and then me revealing about Grandma's money. Corbin was quiet for a long time. Then, he said Keith had shown up at his door Thursday night looking like a ghost and had barely spoken since, just sitting on the couch staring at nothing. Corbin asked my dad if he knew how serious the money thing really was. My dad said none of us knew the full amount yet, but that Marlene had admitted to taking money for a long time. Corbin said this was going to get ugly, and he hoped the family was ready for it. I spent the next several days basically hiding in our apartment. Wesley had to go back to work, so I was alone with my phone, which kept lighting up. Most of the messages I ignored. Claire came by on Tuesday evening with Thai food and let herself in with a spare key. She set the bags on the counter and started pulling out containers without asking if I was hungry, and I appreciated that she didn't make a big deal of it. While we ate, she told me Marlene had been all over Facebook posting cryptic status updates. She showed me her phone. One said something about how blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Another said that some people will smile in your face and stab you in the back. The comment sections were full of relatives asking if she was okay. Claire scrolled to one where our other aunt had commented asking if this was about Thanksgiving, and Marlene had replied with a crying emoji and said that some people in this family had finally shown their true colors. I felt sick reading it. She was painting herself as the victim, the poor, devoted aunt who got betrayed when she was the one who threw a glass and screamed and stole from an 83-year-old woman. Claire put her phone away and told me not to let it get in my head that anyone with sense could see through it. But I knew that wasn't true because most people weren't in the room that night. Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Jason. He said his mom had called him that morning asking about Thanksgiving, and that someone had fed her a completely twisted version of events. According to what she'd heard, I had stood up and announced Aunt Marlene's private financial business in front of the whole family purely to embarrass her because I was throwing a tantrum that she hadn't been told about my pregnancy first. Jason said his mom actually asked him if that was true. He told her the real story, but he wasn't sure she believed him completely. I texted back asking who had told her that version, and he said he didn't know for sure, but it had to be coming from Marlene's side. I was so angry I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Marlene was out there spinning the entire thing to make herself the wronged party. She wasn't telling anyone that she had a screaming meltdown at my pregnancy announcement. She wasn't mentioning the wine glass or the fact that she'd been draining Grandma's accounts for years. She was just the poor, persecuted aunt whose ungrateful niece humiliated her. Jason sent a string of messages saying half the extended family probably thought I was the villain now. He said Marlene had always been good at getting people to feel sorry for her. I knew it was true, and it didn't make it any less infuriating. Thursday morning, my mom called and said she wanted to have a family meeting on Sunday. She said everyone needed to sit down and talk through what happened calmly, like adults, before it tore the whole family apart. She said Marlene and Keith were both invited if they'd come. My stomach dropped because the last thing I wanted was another confrontation while I was pregnant. I told her I didn't think it was a good idea, that I didn't need the stress. She said she understood, but that we couldn't just let this fester. I said Marlene was the one tearing the family apart by lying about what happened. My mom sighed and said that was exactly why we needed to talk face to face. After I hung up, I told Wesley, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at me. He said, maybe we should go so we can tell everyone our side directly, because if we don't show up, Marlene will control the entire narrative. He was right. I texted my mom back and said we'd be there. Sunday came too fast. Wesley and I drove to my parents' house with my stomach in knots. Claire was already there when we walked in, and Jason showed up a few minutes later. My parents were in the kitchen making coffee and setting out cookies like this was a normal gathering. Then Keith walked in alone. He looked terrible. Red eyes, dark circles like he hadn't slept in days. My mom asked where Marlene was, and Keith showed us a text on his phone. It said she refused to be in the same room as me and had nothing to say to any of us. My dad shook his head and muttered something under his breath. We all sat down in the living room, and it was painfully awkward for a minute because nobody knew how to start. Finally, Keith cleared his throat and started talking. He said he'd gone through everything since Thursday night. The bank records, the credit cards, all of it. And it was so much worse than what came out at dinner. He said it wasn't 2 years. It was closer to 4. Marlene had drained tens of thousands of dollars out of Grandma's accounts, a little at a time so nobody would notice. She'd opened that home equity line against Grandma's house and pulled money from it. She'd even opened a credit card in Grandma's name. My mom put her hand over her mouth. Keith kept going, and his voice cracked. He said the part that made him sick wasn't even the money against Grandma. It was that Marlene had been lying to him too for years. They had massive credit card debt he never knew about because she handled all their money and told him everything was fine. She had accounts he didn't know existed. He found deleted emails from a debt settlement company in her trash folder. He said the woman he'd been married to for 30 years had been living a completely different financial life than the one she showed him, and he had no idea. Claire asked what he was going to do. Keith said he was thinking about separating. He said he couldn't be in the same house right now because every time he looked at her, he felt like a fool. Then he looked right at me and asked if anyone else in the family had known before Thanksgiving. Everyone said no, except me. I admitted I'd found the statements about a month earlier when I was helping Grandma. Keith nodded slowly, taking it in. He wasn't angry at me. He actually thanked me for saying it, even though it came out the way it did, because otherwise he'd still be living a lie. My mom spoke up then and said, maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe pulled Keith aside privately. My face got hot. I said Marlene was screaming at me and throwing things and demanding an apology in front of everyone. That I wasn't sitting there strategizing the cleanest way to handle it. I was defending myself after she ruined the happiest news I'd had in years. My dad backed me up immediately. He said, Marlene created this whole situation with her choices, and she shouldn't be blamed for finally being the one to stop protecting her. My mom looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Then the conversation turned to the part that actually mattered, which was Grandma. Everyone agreed that whatever happened with the marriage, Marlene could not have access to Grandma's money for one more day. Grandma didn't want to press charges against her own daughter, and everyone respected that. But my mom was going to take over Grandma's finances with the help of an attorney who handles this kind of thing, and Marlene would sign everything back and set up a repayment plan, or the family would take it further. Keith said if Marlene wanted to save anything, their marriage or her place in this family, she needed individual therapy, financial counseling, and total transparency. And he meant all of it. That evening, I got a message on Facebook from someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Her name was Sati Mercer, a family friend who'd known my parents for decades. She said she'd heard what happened and wanted to reach out because she'd been through almost the exact same thing with her own brother about 8 years ago. Her brother had been managing their mother's money and had quietly drained most of it before anyone caught on. And Sati had been the one to find out and say something, and half her family had turned on her for it at first. She said it took years for the truth to fully settle and for people to understand she'd done the right thing. She offered to talk if I wanted. I messaged her back, and we ended up on the phone for over an hour. She told me the things that had helped her, like being crystal clear about boundaries and accepting that some people won't change no matter what you do. She said the guilt I was feeling was normal, but it wasn't mine to carry because I didn't create the situation. I just refused to keep hiding it. Talking to Sati made me feel less alone than I had in weeks. She understood it in a way that people who haven't lived it just can't. 2 weeks went by, and Marlene didn't contact me at all. I got updates through my mom and Claire. Marlene and Keith had started counseling. Keith had moved back into the house, but they were sleeping in separate rooms. Marlene had met with the attorney and signed everything back over, and Grandma's accounts were now managed by my mom with the attorney's oversight. Marlene had agreed to a repayment plan and started individual therapy. I didn't know how much of it was real and how much was performance, but it was something. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. It said she needed to talk to me in person, just the two of us, no one else. My hands were shaking when I read it. I showed Wesley, and he asked if I wanted him to come. I said yes immediately, because I wasn't ready to face her alone. I suggested a coffee shop near our place, and she agreed. We set it for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Saturday came, and I barely slept the night before. Wesley and I got there 15 minutes early. I ordered a decaf, and we sat at a table in the back corner. Marlene walked in right at 10, and she looked awful. No makeup, hair scraped back, the same dark circles Keith had. She sat down across from us and immediately started to cry. She said her whole life was falling apart, that Keith could barely look at her, that her kids were ashamed of her, that she couldn't eat or sleep. Then she looked at me and said throwing the wine glass was wrong, that there was no excuse for it, and that she was sorry. I didn't say anything. I just waited to see what else she'd say. She kept crying and said she'd been jealous of me for years, that everything seemed to come so easily to me, my marriage, my career, and now the baby, while she felt stuck and invisible. And then she told me the real truth, the part underneath all of it. She said she and Keith had been drowning in debt for years, that she'd made some bad financial decisions early on, and then hid them out of shame and kept hiding them and kept up appearances so nobody would know the perfect aunt who handled everything was actually falling apart. She said when it got bad, she started borrowing from Grandma's accounts, telling herself it was temporary, that she'd pay it back before anyone noticed. And then it spiraled, and she couldn't stop. And she hated herself every single time. But the alternative was admitting to the whole family that she was a failure. She said being the one who handled everything, who everyone depended on, who always knew everything first, that was her entire identity. Admitting she was broke and lying felt like admitting she was nothing. She said her therapist was helping her see that all of it came from the same place: the money and the need to control the family news and be the center of everything. All of it was her trying to feel important, because underneath she felt like she was disappearing. She said Keith had given her an ultimatum, and she'd already had 3 individual sessions, and they were starting couples counseling. She said she was trying to change, and it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. I sat there for a long minute just taking it in. Then I told her I forgave her for Thanksgiving, but that I needed her to respect my boundaries from now on. I said that meant never taking a dime from Grandma again, never sharing my news before I did, and never making my moments about her. She nodded and said she would. She asked if I'd ever consider family therapy with her down the road. I said maybe, after we'd both had time to work on ourselves. She seemed okay with that. When we got up to leave, she hugged me, and it felt different than her usual hugs, less like a performance and more like a person actually holding on. A few days later, my dad called and said Keith had reached out to him. Keith told him they were doing marriage counseling with a man named Wells Apprentice, who specialized in betrayal and rebuilding trust, and that Marlene was seeing a separate financial counselor too. Keith had moved back, but was still in the guest room. He'd given Marlene his conditions for staying: total transparency about every account, individual therapy, no exceptions, a real repayment plan for Grandma, and she was never to touch a family member's finances again as long as she lived. My dad said Keith was dead serious about making it work, but just as serious about his conditions. I was glad. Marlene needed to feel the weight of what she'd done. My next doctor appointment was 2 days later. Wesley came with me like always. The ultrasound tech measured everything and said the baby was growing perfectly, right on track. My doctor checked my blood pressure and said it looked great, then asked how my stress levels had been. I admitted the family drama had been rough. She said she could tell I'd been tense, but that the baby was doing beautifully despite everything, and reminded me I needed to take care of myself and not let family stuff hold me under. I promised I'd try. That weekend, Marlene texted me a photo of a piece of paper. It was homework from her therapist. The assignment was to write down every time she crossed someone's boundaries or deceived them, and to think about how to make amends. Grandma's money was at the top of the list, but there was so much more under it. She'd told my mom about Claire's first pregnancy before Claire could. She'd announced Jason's divorce to the extended family before he was ready. She'd taken credit for organizing the family reunion when it was actually my mom who did all the work. She'd borrowed money from 2 other relatives years ago and never paid it back. She'd let everyone believe she was covering Grandma's care costs out of her own pocket when she was actually paying for it with Grandma's own money. There were 12 different things just on the first page. Seeing it laid out like that made me realize this was never really about me or the pregnancy. She'd been doing this to everyone in 100 small ways for as long as I could remember. I texted her back and said I appreciated her being honest about it. She sent back a single heart. My mom called a week later. She said Christmas was coming and asked if we could all get together without another disaster. I said I didn't know, but I was willing to try if everyone else was. She suggested something low-key instead of a big formal dinner. Just appetizers and games at our house, nothing fancy, no pressure. I said that sounded a lot better than trying to force a normal holiday. She said she'd check with everyone, and a few days later she texted the family group chat with the plan, and everyone said they were in. The following Saturday, Claire and Jason came over to help us set up the nursery. Wesley had painted the walls the weekend before. Now, we needed to build the furniture and organize all the tiny clothes. Jason worked on the crib while Claire helped me fold onesies. She held one up that said, "Mommy's Little Miracle," and made a joke that at least this kid would never be short on family stories to tell in therapy someday. I laughed, because it was true. This kid was going to grow up hearing about the Thanksgiving Aunt Marlene threw a wine glass across the dining room. Wesley brought us pizza, and we sat on the floor eating surrounded by boxes, and it felt good to focus on something that was actually happy for once. By the end of the day, we had the crib built and the dresser assembled, and the room finally looked like a nursery. On Tuesday, I got a letter in the mail from Marlene. No return address, but I knew her handwriting. I opened it walking up the stairs. It was 2 full pages. She started by saying her therapist had helped her think it through, but the words were all her own. She said she was sorry for every moment she'd ever stolen from me, and for every dollar she'd taken from Grandma, and for every lie she'd told to keep her image intact. She listed specific things going back years: my engagement, my promotion, the house, and the money, all of it, with no excuses attached. She said she understood now that she'd done it because she felt like she was failing at her own life and needed everyone to see her as the one who had it all together. She said she'd hurt people over and over and never truly apologized before. She said she wasn't asking me to forgive her right away or trust her again immediately. She just wanted me to know that she finally understood what she'd done and why it was wrong, and that she was committed to changing even though it was the hardest thing she'd ever faced. There was not a single excuse in the whole letter. I read it twice and then showed it to Wesley. He said it seemed like real progress. I agreed, but a part of me was still braced for the other shoe to drop. Christmas came faster than I expected. My mom called the week before to confirm everyone was still on board, and I asked if Marlene was coming. She said Marlene had confirmed she'd be there with Keith and seemed genuinely nervous about it. I felt nervous too, but also curious whether the changes were real or just a good performance. Wesley reminded me we didn't have to stay in any situation that felt bad. We could leave whenever we wanted. The morning of Christmas Eve, my dad texted that he'd talked to Keith the night before and that the counseling was actually helping them communicate for the first time in years. He said Marlene had been completely open about every account and every dollar, that she'd handed over full access to everything, and that she was sticking to the repayment plan without a single complaint. My dad said Keith was cautiously hopeful. I texted back asking if he thought Marlene would really keep it up or if this was temporary. And my dad said only time would tell, but he'd never once seen her take responsibility like this in his life. We got to my parents' house around noon, and Claire was already there setting up appetizers. Jason showed up right after us with a cheese board. The house felt relaxed instead of tense. My mom had put out board games and cards on the coffee table and made it clear this wasn't about a perfect meal. Grandma Ruth was in her usual chair by the window, looking better than she had at Thanksgiving, and I noticed my mom stayed close to her the whole day. Marlene arrived with Keith around 1, carrying a wrapped gift and a dish for the table. She spotted me across the room and gave me a small wave, not the big dramatic hug she used to force on people, just a simple wave. She set her things down and came over to where Wesley and I were standing. She asked how I was feeling and whether the pregnancy was going well. I said everything was good and the baby was healthy. She smiled and said she was really happy for us. And then she actually turned and went to help my mom in the kitchen instead of standing there taking over the conversation. I looked at Wesley, and he raised his eyebrows because we were both thinking the same thing. This was not the Marlene we knew. All afternoon, she kept surprising me. When Jason told a long story about a disaster at his job, she laughed and asked questions instead of cutting in with a story of her own. When Claire mentioned she was thinking about going back to school, Marlene asked what for instead of immediately giving her opinion. When my dad brought up my pregnancy and asked how I was handling it, Marlene let me answer without jumping in with her decades of expertise. She was there. She was part of it, but she wasn't running it. She was warm with Grandma, but she didn't hover or perform her devotion for an audience. And I noticed she didn't go anywhere near the topic of money or bills. We played a few rounds of cards, and she laughed at her own terrible hand, and Keith actually smiled, for the first time I'd seen in weeks. Before dinner, she pulled the wrapped box out of her bag and handed it to me. She said it was for the baby, and she hoped I liked it. I opened it and found a hand-knitted blanket, soft gray with little stars worked into the pattern, and it was clear she'd spent a long time on it. She said she'd been making it in the evenings over the past few weeks. She didn't announce it to the room or wait for everyone to admire her. She just handed it to me quietly and looked genuinely happy when I said it was beautiful. After dinner, my mom pulled me into the kitchen while everyone was cleaning up and hugged me and said, "Thank you for giving Marlene a chance." She said she could see real change in her sister, and it meant everything to have the family in one room again without a war breaking out. I told her I was still being careful, but I had to admit Marlene seemed different. My mom said she'd been praying for exactly this, and that watching Marlene actually do the work gave her hope. I said I was hopeful too, but I needed to see her keep it up. My mom said that was fair. Marlene stayed until around 8, and then said the kids needed to get home. She hugged everyone goodbye, including me, and it was a normal hug. Not too long, not for show, just a regular hug. She told me to text her if I ever needed anything and left with Keith. After they were gone, Claire came over and asked what I thought. I said I didn't know what to think because it was so unlike her. Jason said maybe the whole disaster had actually shocked her into finally facing herself. Claire said she was impressed that Marlene hadn't made a single thing about herself the entire day. Wesley said it was real progress, but we should stay cautious. And I agreed. One good day didn't erase 4 years of lies, but it was a start. The first week of January, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Something made me pick up. It was Marlene, calling from her therapist's office. She said Wells had asked whether I'd be willing to come to one of their sessions, that he thought it might help if we could talk through our relationship with a professional guiding it. My stomach dropped because sitting in a therapy room with Marlene sounded like the last thing I wanted to do. But then I thought about my baby, and how I wanted him or her to grow up with a family that wasn't fractured, to know their great aunt and their cousins. I asked Marlene if this was something she actually wanted, or if the therapist was pushing her into it. She said she wanted it because she missed having me in her life. I told her I needed to think and talk to Wesley. She said that was fine. I called Wesley at work, and he said it was my decision, but that a neutral person in the room might keep things productive. Claire said the same thing. Jason said he'd support whatever I chose. I spent 2 days thinking, and then texted Marlene that I'd come to one session. 3 days later, I walked into a small office building and found the right suite. Marlene was already in the waiting room, looking nervous. She gave me a weak smile, and I sat across from her, and neither of us said anything until the door opened, and a man in his 50s with glasses came out and introduced himself as Wells. He led us into his office, and we sat on opposite ends of a couch while he took the chair facing us. He thanked me for coming and said the goal today was just to open up communication and make sure we both felt heard. He asked me to start by explaining how Marlene's behavior over the years had affected me. I took a breath and said it had made me feel like I couldn't trust her with anything that mattered because every good thing that ever happened to me became hers to announce, like my life was just material for her to perform with. And I said the money was the thing that broke it completely, because it showed she'd betray even Grandma, even an old woman who trusted her, if it served her. I said the pregnancy was the final straw because I'd already lost one baby and I needed to protect this one on my own terms. Wells asked Marlene if she understood what I was saying. Her eyes filled up, but she said yes. She said she'd never let herself think about how her actions landed on other people, because she was too busy managing how everything made her look. Wells asked her to say more, and she said she'd felt invisible in her own life for years, and being the one who knew everything and handled everything and controlled everything was the only thing that made her feel like she existed. She said it was selfish, and she understood that now. I felt myself getting emotional hearing her say it out loud in front of a stranger. Wells asked how it felt to hear that, and I said it helped me understand why, but it didn't erase what happened. Marlene nodded and said she wasn't asking me to forget. She just wanted a chance to be better. Wells said that was a good place to start and asked if we were both willing to work on rebuilding trust, and we both said yes. Over the next few weeks, I went to a couple more sessions and had a few coffees with Marlene, where we practiced just talking without falling into the old patterns. She worked hard at listening instead of waiting for her turn. Wesley said he could see the difference in how she was around me. My belly was getting bigger every day, and I could feel the baby moving more and more. One morning, Marlene texted asking if she could stop by that afternoon, and when I said yes, she showed up with a stack of containers. She'd spent the whole morning cooking freezer meals for after the baby came, soups and casseroles and pasta, everyone labeled with heating instructions. She said she figured ready-made dinners would help those first exhausted weeks. I was touched because she didn't have to do any of it. She asked what else I might need, and I said I wasn't sure since it was all new. She said to let her know anytime and that she didn't expect to be in the delivery room or anything. She just wanted to help however I was comfortable with. She stayed about half an hour and left. When Wesley got home and saw the freezer full of food, he said she was really making an effort, and it showed. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday night, I was on the couch watching TV when I felt a strange cramp. And then my water broke right there in the living room. I called for Wesley, and he came running. He grabbed the hospital bag we'd packed weeks ago and got me to the car. The contractions got stronger on the drive, and I breathed through them the way we'd learned in class. Wesley called my parents from the road, and my mom asked if we wanted her to tell Marlene. I said yes, because even though we weren't as close as we used to be, she was still family, and I wanted her to know. Wesley dropped me at the entrance and went to park while a nurse got me into a wheelchair. They took me up to labor and delivery, and the doctor said I was already 4 centimeters. The contractions kept getting worse, and I asked for the epidural, and after about 20 minutes, the pain finally eased. Wesley sat beside me holding my hand. My parents arrived around 10 and sat with us, my mom telling me I was doing great and my dad looking terrified. Labor went on for hours. Around 8 the next morning, the doctor said it was time to push. Wesley stood next to me, coaching me through it, and after what felt like forever, I heard crying, and the doctor said it was a boy. They put him on my chest, and he was perfect, tiny and warm, with a little cap of dark hair. Wesley was crying, and I was crying, and we couldn't believe he was finally here. The nurses weighed him at 8 pounds, 1 ounce, and wrapped him up and handed him back to me, and I just stared at his face. My parents came in first to meet their grandson. My mom cried and held him while my dad took 100 pictures. They stayed about an hour and then left to let us rest. Claire and Jason came next with flowers and a stuffed elephant. Claire held him and said he was gorgeous. Jason looked nervous to hold him but did anyway and grinned the whole time. They left after about half an hour. Marlene came last with Keith carrying a gift bag. She came over to the bed and asked if she could hold him, and I said yes and passed him over. Her face just melted looking down at him. Tears ran down her cheeks and she whispered that he was beautiful, and she told me I was going to be an amazing mom. She only stayed 20 minutes before handing him back and saying we needed our rest, and she and Keith left. She'd respected every boundary without me having to say a word. The first weeks at home were harder than I expected. He cried constantly, and I barely slept, and Wesley had to go back to work after 2 weeks. Marlene texted every few days asking how things were going, and she'd offer specific things like picking up groceries or coming to hold the baby so I could nap. She never just showed up the way she used to. She always waited for me to say yes. One afternoon, I was so exhausted I couldn't think straight, so I texted asking if she could come hold him for an hour, and she was there in 15 minutes. I went upstairs and slept while she rocked him downstairs, and I woke up feeling human again. She'd also done my dishes and folded a basket of laundry. I thanked her, and she said that was what family was for, and it did feel different than before, because she was doing it because I asked, not so she could tell everyone what a wonderful aunt she was. At his 2-month checkup, the pediatrician said he was healthy and gaining weight perfectly, and that I was doing a great job. Wesley and I were finally learning his cries and his rhythms. Having family around who actually respected us made everything easier. My mom came by once a week to give me a break. Claire brought dinner. Marlene checked in regularly, but never pushed if I said I was busy. When the baby was about 10 weeks old, Marlene and I met for coffee. She told me therapy was helping her understand herself, that she'd realized her whole identity had gotten wrapped up in being the family's fixer, and she'd forgotten who she was underneath it. She'd started taking a pottery class on Saturday mornings and joined a walking group, small things that were just for her. She was sticking to the repayment plan, and Grandma's finances were solid and protected now. She seemed lighter, less desperate to be needed. I was proud of her, which was not a thing I ever expected to feel. My dad mentioned to Wesley one night that Keith said their marriage was better than it had been in years, that they were actually talking honestly for the first time, that the whole crisis had forced them to face things they'd buried for a decade. Keith said he was grateful they got the chance to rebuild instead of just quietly falling apart. On the baby's 3-month birthday, we had everyone over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just pizza and salad. My parents came, and Claire and Jason, and Marlene and Keith, and my mom brought Grandma. The kids ran around the backyard while the adults talked. Marlene helped set the table and kept an eye on the little ones. She complimented Claire on her haircut and asked Jason about his new job. She wasn't making anything about herself. She held the baby and played with him and handed him back the moment he started fussing, instead of insisting she could settle him. Grandma sat in the good chair with a blanket over her knees, and at one point, I watched Marlene bring her a plate and sit with her for a while, just talking. And it looked like something that was finally honest. Everyone got along without any tension. It felt peaceful in a way our family gatherings never used to. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in the nursery, rocking my son while he drifted off in my arms. I thought about that Thanksgiving, the screaming in the broken glass and Grandma's small, scared voice asking if her money was gone. It was the worst night our family ever had, but it was also the night everything finally came into the light. And somehow, out of all that wreckage, things got better. Marlene got help and paid it back and started facing the truth about herself. Grandma's money is safe now. Keith and Marlene rebuilt their marriage on something real for the first time. We all learned to say what we mean and to respect where the lines are. My family's healthier now than it has ever been in my whole life, and I'm glad more than I can say that my son is going to grow up knowing his great aunt is the person she's becoming instead of the person she was. He fell asleep against my chest, and I stood there a while just feeling him breathe. And then I laid him down in the crib and watched him for another minute before I went downstairs to Wesley. This whole experience was a roller coaster. Have you ever had a family blow up that actually led to positive change in the long run? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below.